So a very warm welcome to Campion Hall. My name's Father Nick Austin. I'm the Master of Campion Hall, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for this term's Campion lecture. I'm going to turn over in a moment to Dr. Hiba Salem, who is the Pedro Rupe Fellow in Forced Migration Studies here at the Hall. Her own research focuses on refugee education and the trajectories of young people, and especially the role hope plays in their trajectories. So just mentioning the Pedro Rupe Fellowship, it's a good moment to welcome our colleagues here and online involved in that post as well. We work together with the Refugee Studies Centre here in Oxford, which is a leading centre for multidisciplinary studies in forced migration. And we also work with the Jesuit Refugee Service International. Our lecturer this evening is a former Pedro Rupe Fellow, so you have the rare moment of glimpsing two Pedro Rupe Fellows on the same stage. And we're just looking at applications for the next Pedro Rupe Fellow, and there are over 100. So we have quite a bit of reading to do tonight before the shortlisting meeting tomorrow. But very warm welcome, and I think we're in for a very interesting conversation and looking forward very much to hearing the research that Cory has been conducting in Beirut. So over to you, Hiba.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Cory Rodgers, who was the previous Pedro Rupe Fellow in Forced Migration Studies. He's now Assistant Professor of Migration at the Lebanese American University. And Cory received his DPhil in anthropology from Oxford. And throughout his career, he has focused on different forms of mobility, especially nomadic and on pastoralists, as well as refugee studies. And he's worked across different contexts, especially in Kenya and across Eastern Africa. But recently, he's been working on Lebanon, which is the context that he'll cover today. And I'm going to hand over to you, and very excited to hear your talk today.
Thanks, Hiba, and thank you also, Nick, and everyone for coming. The work that I'm going to talk about today is coming from a project that I conducted from 2020 to 2023. And the project ended in 2023, and I was basically just working on write-up. But afterward, some events happened in Lebanon that sort of had me return to some of these issues and reflect upon what these recent events showed about the issue that I was studying. I also want to mention that this project that I was working on, called the SOCHO project, Social Cohesion as a Humanitarian Objective, it was funded in part by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but it was also partially supported by the Rupe Fellowship. So I have, there's my gratitude to the Hall for that. And also the support that the Hall provided to me after I finished the fellowship when I was an associate fellow. So thank you again for that. The topic of my lecture, social cohesion, has been the focus of much of my research since 2021. But I'm not studying cohesion as the social phenomenon itself, as a quality of communities, of societies or nations or other social groups. Rather than cohesion as a measure of the quality of groupiness, which would be the sociological approach, I became interested in how social cohesion has become a policy objective, in particular among humanitarian actors, and especially humanitarian actors in the global south. Certainly, research on this topic does require that I attend to what is actually happening in communities that are the targets of humanitarian action, how people are interacting within and across different identity groups, like refugees and host communities, migrants and locals, aid recipients and non-recipients in some cases. But my main focus is how aid organizations have made social cohesion part of their response to protracted displacement. The rise of social cohesion in the humanitarian space is first and foremost a means of addressing the fact that protracted displacement has become the norm rather than the exception across much of the global south. The countries and communities that host a disproportionate number of the world's refugees have become concerned about the long-term impact of hosting has on their systems. This includes their social services, their job markets, rental prices in areas where refugees are living, and of course, in some areas, also the impact on the environment, etc. As such, it has also become highly politicized. This burden on host communities was one of the major challenges that was highlighted in the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, and it was a key motivation in the development of the Global Refugee Compact, which was passed in 2019. Social cohesion was supposed to present a vision for how to work through this increasingly politicized space, for aid responses that attend to both the needs and concerns of the affected host communities, while also ensuring that refugees and other migrants enjoy some level of inclusion in the societies that host them. These refugee hosting policies are no stranger in Lebanon. They're which is widely recognized as the country that over the past decade has hosted the most refugees per capita in the world. Since 2012, it is estimated that between 1.5, maybe up to 2 million Syrians have sought refuge in Lebanon, with numbers increasing during some of the periods of most intense fighting in Syria. The exact numbers are not actually known, as the Lebanese government required the UNHCR to stop registering Syrians starting in May 2015. So there's a number of people, I think around 700,000 or 800,000 who are officially registered. The rest, as for the numbers, are all based on estimates. Aid actors have integrated social cohesion into their work, either as a distinct area of intervention, a way of fostering social cohesion between refugees and their host communities, or as a concern that is mainstreamed across other areas of programming, such as the provision of shelter, the provision of water and sanitation services, or simply the provision of cash aid. I conducted research initially to understand this trend from 2021 to 2023. And the study included interviews with aid organizations, interviews with people who were participating in programs, as well as Lebanese residents in the areas where Syrians were living. And it also included several in-depth case studies of specific social cohesion interventions. The study was actually a comparative work between Lebanon and Kenya, which was the place I'd been working since I did my PhD in 2015. And I was trying to understand how this social cohesion agenda was being localized in the contexts of both places. Kenya was the area with which I was much more familiar. As an anthropologist, it's the area where I had been working to learn the languages and could conduct a lot of field work on my own. I will say that in Lebanon, I am not a fluent Arabic speaker, and for a lot of my work, I relied on working with co-researchers, including Ms. Watfa Najdi, who is now doing her PhD in Rotterdam. An important part of the study was understanding how organizations in Lebanon conceptualized and operationalized cohesion. And as I'll describe in this lecture, a big part of the story in Lebanon is that social cohesion has largely been cast in a different lexicon, and that is as social stabilization. I wrapped up my project in 2023, but then recent events in Lebanon, namely Israel's conflict with Hezbollah and the large-scale escalation of Israeli bombings across Lebanon late last year, brought my attention back to this topic. One might say that the crisis of these months and the long and highly destructive assault on Lebanon was something of a test for the social cohesion that the aid sector was trying to promote. So, as I will argue, if cohesion in Lebanon is largely framed now as stability, then there's some level of success based on the outcomes of what happened after the ceasefire. This is evident in the fact that the conflict did not drive Lebanon into an internal conflict, which was what some external and internal observers were suggesting might happen. But there were also enormous failings in the aid response to provide support to marginalized groups, especially displaced Syrians, but also including the more than 250,000 migrant domestic workers who live and work in Lebanon. And in this regard, I would argue that the stability framing of cohesion that has been taken on in Lebanon seems to have lost many of the most fundamental ambitions of the original concept. So globally, the history of social cohesion in national policy goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s. Initially, it became a concern for countries in the global north that were receiving more and more diverse profiles of migrants. And as their populations became more diverse, some of the old modernist ideas of the national community based on ideas of a shared background, shared culture, shared values started to fall apart. Countries such as Canada began looking for new ways to conceptualize social cohesion that accommodated diversity. This was one particularly influential framework that was developed in Canada that had 5 different axes or 5 different issues that needed to be considered in terms of thinking about whether people could achieve a sense of cohesion, regardless, in this case, of increasing diversity. So it was an alternative to the old idea of groups being based on common values, in many cases an idea of even common ethnicity in the modernist idea of the nation state. In Lebanon, cohesion initially became a priority after the end of the civil war in the 1990s, when Lebanon was attempting to move through various peace and reconciliation processes. There was an attempt to bring people together across different political groupings and across different sectarian backgrounds, and ultimately to heal the wounds of war. Cohesion finally made its way into humanitarian policy through the regional refugee response to the Syrian war in 2011. For the first decade of this response, social cohesion was incorporated in a variety of ways and changed over time, with different approaches that were implemented in each of the 5 countries that were mostly hosting most of the Syrians displaced in the region. And this was Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, and of course, Lebanon. It wasn't actually until 2022 that there was really a definition for social cohesion put out, and this was in a guidance paper that was put out. And the definition that was put out was the management of social tensions within a community so as to prevent conflict and foster opportunities for collaboration between groups. And this is very much in line with what social cohesion, something that would make sense in terms of what social cohesion was as a matter of national policy for countries in the global north before. However, there were also differing approaches, as I noted, in different places. So in Turkey, social cohesion was very much embraced and was in fact mainstreamed across all of the areas of their programming. It was sometimes cast in the terms of harmonization, but it wasn't necessarily made one area of work, but something that was mainstreamed across all areas of work. In Egypt, it was actually its own sector of work, and it was included with livelihoods. So this was just part of the way that social cohesion was pursued in the context of Egypt. And in Lebanon, as I've already mentioned, there was this turn to the idea of Lebanon having a stability sector. So the term social cohesion was not used, and instead stability was used. And I'll just note that the report actually does describe what this means when you think about what these terms, what the approach is in each of these countries. So in Turkey, the idea of social cohesion was a society that works toward the well-being of all members of a society or community, addresses exclusion and marginalization, creates a sense of belonging, promotes trust, and offers its members the opportunity of upward mobility. And I would note that this is very much in line with the idea of social cohesion that I described originally as a response to increasing and diversified migration trends in the global north in places such as Canada. Lebanon's definition with this stability orientation was different. It focused on the support of positive behaviors and change agents within communities, and especially with an effort of an attempt to prevent social tensions from resulting in conflict. So it was a conflict-averse idea of social cohesion. The reason for this turn towards stability in Lebanon was explained in several of the interviews that we conducted with aid organizations. As a staff member from one organization explained, at some point, the Lebanese government became sensitive to this concept of social cohesion. Even there were some Lebanese intellectuals that said this concept paves the way toward nationalization of Syrians, and so we shifted towards social stability. So explaining that this was largely a matter of the government not accepting the idea of social cohesion for Syrians, because this would imply their long-term presence and even potentially integration in Lebanon, which was not accepted as which was not politically acceptable. Or another quote from someone in another organization: "To avoid any backlash from the government, we avoid using this term. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but we got the message from the government. The term social cohesion can create fear among certain parts of the country about the integration of Syrian refugees in the long term, most of them being Sunni. We aim at reducing pressure and tension and supporting the host community, but we're not here to encourage any integration or inclusion or social cohesion between these communities. So I became interested in the fact that this switch in term was in some ways seen as an alternative framing of social cohesion. And yet in my interviews, I was in many ways hearing that social cohesion was being put aside, that the stability approach was something different from social cohesion. The shift in terminology is in many ways a pragmatic move by aid actors that one might say is adapted to the political realities in Lebanon, where there has been widespread opposition to the long-term presence of Syrians. The reasons for this are manifold, and it does depend on which particular area of Lebanon you're looking at, or where you're asking this question in. In some areas, Syrians have been seen as a source of unfair job competition who will accept wages that are far below what Lebanese would accept. So this is a common concern in areas that are receiving refugees. There were concerns that the presence of Syrians was putting pressure on social services that were already stretched thin, everything from health and education services to waste collection and sanitation, especially in areas with a high density of Syrians, such as the Bekaa Valley and Akkar in the north. And there were, I will note, some of the aid interventions were directly addressing this. There was support to the municipalities that provide services in an attempt to alleviate some of these concerns. Another set of concerns was what was sometimes called the historical dimension. And this relates to the fact that until 2006, the Syrian regime was in many ways occupying Lebanon after the civil war. And this had very negative consequences for some of the communities and some of the neighborhoods in Lebanon. This is aside from the fact that many of the refugees from Syria were fleeing from the same regime or the same administration, the Assad regime that had actually been undertaking that occupation. Nonetheless, for a lot of communities, the fact was that they didn't want Syrians in their country after the end of the occupation. So this is sometimes described as the historical reason as opposed to these economic reasons. And there are a number of other concerns. One other that I would note that is also, it's sort of questionable whether this should actually be a concern, is that Lebanon has a confessional system of government. So there's a concern that if refugees from one particular religious group move into the country and are later integrated, that this would upset the confessional balance between Christians, Shia, Sunni, and the other sects that make up Lebanon's 18 sects. This is a bit of a strange answer because there was never really any talk about Syrians being permanently integrated, let alone naturalized. Nonetheless, it seemed to be automatically a concern in Lebanon whenever the influx after displacement occurred. So for all of these various reasons, cohesion was off the table, and we have turned to a different word, from cohesion to stabilization. And as a matter of dealing with it's a matter of dealing with the political milieu of Lebanon. So in a sense, we could say cohesion and its implications hit a nerve among some politicians. As Caroline Quejato and Lauren Landau wrote in an article in the Journal of Refugee Studies in 2017, increasingly international organizations are being asked to work locally with a range of actors that may have little interest in or knowledge of or capacity to protect the displaced. Rather, they may have every interest in not doing so. So trying to negotiate a space within which one can undertake their aid programming is part of the reason for this shift in terminology. The humanitarian field is, of course, well known for being based on principles, issues of neutrality, impartiality, rule of law, which are intended to be the backbone of humanitarian planning. Nonetheless, it's arguable that the political realities within which aid actors work has made some level of pragmatic adjustment necessary. As such, Quejato and Landau call for aid actors to seek local literacy and to find the right discourse and language within which to work toward refugee protection in the places where they work. And it could be argued that this was what was happening with this shift toward stability. I will note that in my work in Kenya, I did see something similar to this. So in the work that I was doing at the Kakuma refugee camp and the Kalobeye settlement in the far northwest of Kenya, I observed one case where aid agencies, and I've also studied this case with Nahiko Omada, who's here right now. This was a case where the local government, the local Turkana County government, was engaged about ways of making the presence of refugees something of a benefit for the local host community, so that investments in the camp would also open up services for local people, so that refugee aid could be provided in cash and then going into local host community businesses, rather than just bringing in-kind aid into the region. And ultimately, it was described as a possible scenario that could be a win-win situation for refugees and the host community. It's not to say there aren't problems with the way this was framed in Kenya, but what struck me was that in 2020, the national government made an attempt to close the refugee camps for a number of political and even diplomatic reasons at the time. Nonetheless, the local government, the members of the local county government actually stood up and rejected what the government was saying that the local Turkana County government did not see this as closing the camps as a reasonable step forward, and actually provided some level of political support for the aid organizations such as UNHCR that were trying to maintain this space of protection. This was the MP for Turkana West, where Kakuma camp is located, and in 2020 he made, Daniel Epuyo, he made several statements arguing that the national government should reconsider its position. So we could argue that when social cohesion and the long-term presence of refugees is framed in a certain way, it can be successfully pitched to local governments and be made attractive to them, such that they can actually be drawn upon as allies or advocates in times when there is a crisis. Now, Lebanon has been in a state of protracted crisis, what actually has been called numerous intersecting crises since 2019. At that time, the country entered a period of economic and financial collapse due to the crumbling of the banking system, which had been propped up as by the Reserve, and also had been carrying out largely corrupt practices that were sort of revealed in 2019. Over the next 2 years, the currency in Lebanon lost over 90% of its. Actually, I think I went here, I'll stop there. The currency lost over 90% of its value. Many families saw their savings wiped out, many of them without ever being able to withdraw any money, because the banks, as soon as this collapse started to happen, put capital controls on all of the accounts. So the middle class was kind of washed out in a very short period of time in Lebanon. Poverty levels among Lebanese reached nearly 50%, and even higher among displaced Syrians. And inequality was soaring. This was, of course, as in many places, compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And for residents of Beirut, just a year later in 2020, there was enormous destruction wrought by the Beirut port explosion. So all of these compounding crises had created a similar sense of there being a protracted crisis in Lebanon, even at the time when I was starting my research. And this also created more of a concern about tensions about the distribution of aid, who the winners and losers would be, and tensions about what the long-term presence of Syrians would be in a country that was already, where many Lebanese were already dealing with a lot of vulnerability. The country entered a new episode of acute crisis on October 8th, 2023, when Hezbollah fired missiles at the Israeli Defense Force positions in the occupied Sheba Farms area in solidarity with Hamas's Operation Al-Aqsa Storm from the day before. The Operation Al-Aqsa Storm killed 695 Israeli civilians, 71 foreign nationals, and 373 members of the security force in what has been largely condemned as a massacre. As the Israeli military embarked on a retaliation that has been characterized as collective punishment of the entire population of the Gaza enclave, Hezbollah kept up its fighting from southern Lebanon in solidarity with Hamas. For the first 11 months of the conflict, there was a back and forth exchange of artillery shells, missiles, and drones, as well as some small-scale skirmishes between ground troops. This conflict was characterized by uneven use of force, with Israeli attacks totaling about 4 times those of Hezbollah. And there was also a huge difference in, of course, the military power. Israel relied heavily on airstrikes, while Hezbollah has neither an air force nor any kind of anti-air defense that could be used against Israel's F-15 fighter jets. Nonetheless, most of the fighting for the initial months of this conflict followed the so-called rules of engagement, in which both sides use some level of restraint to prevent the outbreak of an all-out war. The fighting was said to be contained at the border region, where most of the displacement occurred just on either side of the blue line, both in Israel and in Lebanon. In September 2024, almost a year after the start of this conflict, Israel entered a period generally referred to as the escalation, which saw violence spread northward into the rest of Lebanon. The conflict began with a sequence of assassination operations, including the remote detonation of about 5,000 pagers that had been distributed to Hezbollah operatives. This resulted in about a dozen deaths and resulted also in severe injuries among nearly 3,000 people throughout Lebanon. Then on September 23rd, Israel launched Operation Northern Arrows, which started a nationwide air campaign in Lebanon. Just in the first 7 days, there were over 800 airstrikes across the country, mostly focused on areas where the population was Shia, which was seen to be the population that was the major supporter of Hezbollah. So most of these were focused on the south, the Bekaa Valley, and the southern suburbs of Beirut, Dahia. The reason for Israel's attacks was to destroy Hezbollah weapons and assassinate their leadership. Israel also appeared to be implementing its familiar Dahia doctrine, which is the strategic use of disproportionate force and deliberate targeting of residential areas and civilian infrastructure in order to quickly shatter the support base of its enemy. By the time a ceasefire was reached on November 27th, at least 3,947 people in Lebanon had been killed over the course of the 14 months of conflict, most of them within the final 2 months of that period. At least 16,000 were injured, and well over 1 million were displaced within Lebanon. And you can see here this very sharp uptick with the start of Operation Northern Arrows. So aside from concerns about the immediate consequences of this bombardment, the lives lost, the homes destroyed, the people displaced, there were also larger concerns about how the attacks might affect relations among Lebanon's political parties and communities. The big political concern was whether the uneven exposure to Israel's assault, which was largely focused, as I mentioned, on Shia neighborhoods and villages, would push opposing political factions into an internal conflict. Hezbollah and their political ally Harakat Amal, which made up most of the Shia bloc in Lebanese politics, have long been at odds with Christian parties such as the UAT, the Lebanese forces, including an armed clash that did occur in southern Beirut just in October 2021, but which ended after just a few hours. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was explicit in his call for domestic opposition to Hezbollah, beseeching the Lebanese population to, quote, stand up and take your country back, or risk, quote, the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering, just like we see in Gaza. So a lot of observers, I think a lot of people who were looking at the rhetoric being used by Israel themselves understood that there was an intentional attempt to try to push the country into domestic conflict as sort of a strategic act to try to remove Hezbollah and, just, of course, to remove them as a risk to Israel, as a threat to Israel. The threat to stability went beyond party politics. With part of Lebanon's population, especially Lebanese Shia, living under the crosshairs of daily attacks, and other parts sitting sitting safely in relatively untouched parts of the country, there was concern about this creating a sort of inequality of exposure. As displaced people from heavily targeted areas started arriving to other parts of the country seeking shelter, stability was also tested by people's willingness to give shelter to those displaced households. Schools and other structures were turned into temporary shelters for the displaced, and many people who had left the country or left to other areas of Lebanon did open up their homes for people displaced from the conflict areas to move into. But there was a fear among many that in opening your house to a displaced person, you might be unwittingly welcoming someone into the house who was being targeted by Israel, or someone whom Israel would identify as a target, whether that was justified or not. This made many reticent to actually open their homes to people from outside, to people who were coming from the south, from the Bekaa Valley, from Dahye. Fortunately for Lebanon, the ceasefire was reached on November 27th without any major incidents between parties or between militias within Lebanon. There was surprising solidarity shown despite these concerns that I just explained, and more widely an understanding, of course, that fighting within Lebanon, a domestic conflict, would result in yet further destruction that the country just probably could not handle. For the most part, the people of Lebanon averted the worst case scenario of a domestic struggle between Hezbollah and those who oppose it. There remain very different perspectives on what should happen now during the ceasefire period, and I would point to a recent report put out by the International Crisis Group, which lays out some of the risks as well as opportunities for Lebanon moving forward into the post-war period. However, if Lebanon managed to pass a test of stability in regard to domestic politics, I would make a very different assessment of what it says in terms of social cohesion, and especially in regard to the place of non-Lebanese present in Lebanon during the crisis. In the attacks, while Lebanese were welcomed into shelters, Syrians were largely left to find their own places to stay. When the Ministry of Education opened up the schools as shelters, this was largely designated for Lebanese and Palestinians. And meanwhile, there were reports of some Syrians being evicted from their homes in order to make room for displaced Lebanese. Many shelters were, in one of the accounts that I heard, a displaced Syrian man who was living in the southern town of Nabatea was forced along with other residents of the town to leave during the Israeli bombing. He initially moved to Sadnael, where he had some friends, not family, but friends living in the Bekaa area. And he found that all of the formal shelters in this area were only for displaced Lebanese. He did manage to find one informal school inside of an informal tented settlement, which is the term generally used for the camp-like places where some displaced Syrians have been living. And he was allowed to stay there until he could find another shelter. After the ceasefire, he went back to his rented apartment in Nabatea, but found that he had been evicted so that a local Lebanese family who had lost their house could be given a place to stay. More than 300,000 Syrians also decided to make their way back to Syria during this time. Some did so before the fall of the Assad regime, which occurred on 8th of December, thus putting themselves at risk of potential persecution from that government. Even before the change of the regime, which removed some of this, even after the change of regime, which removed some of the threats for state-based persecution, much of this migration was wrongly characterized as voluntary return. In reality, it was just another wave of displacement, or what you might even call cyclical displacement, for people fleeing their place of refuge back to a place where they could find relative physical security, but also in many cases waiting because they knew they would not actually find a sustainable kind of security where they were moving. Many who went back to Syria didn't actually have a home to go back to. Others would not be welcomed even after the change of regimes by the local authorities in their areas, some of whom remained in place. And also, aside from, and this was also one of the border crossings, the Masna border crossing into Syria, where the Israeli Air Force actually hit the crossing in order to stop any flow of weapons into Lebanon. This also meant that everyone had to walk across the border if they were trying to make their way out of Lebanon back to Syria. Aside from refugees, Lebanon is also host to an estimated 250,000 migrant workers from an array of countries, including the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Migrants were also largely neglected and left to their own to find shelter when displaced during the war. Migrant workers working in Lebanon do so under the kafala system, which is an arrangement for procuring and governing migrant labor that has been largely described as highly exploitative, and sometimes even resulting in conditions similar to slavery. Many migrant workers were put out of their homes by their employers as their employers left to seek safer areas, and they were simply told to fend for themselves. So there were many migrants who were sort of coming together in small groupings, sleeping on, in some cases, the beach, on the Corniche, parks that they could find, but were largely left to their own devices. I was following along with some Kenyan women who I know from previous research, and they explained that not only were many people put out of their homes, but they didn't even have the option to go home, to go back to Kenya during the war. One reason being that often their sponsors, their kafil, would hold on to their documents and did not give them back whenever they left them out of the house because they didn't want them to run away. The second reason was that the Lebanese government generally charges a lot of migrants a clearance fee, which usually has to be negotiated before people can leave. If you don't have the money to pay that clearance fee, which in some cases can be several $100s, even I've heard of some people being asked for $1,000, you're not allowed to board a plane. So they were literally stuck in the country during this time and unable to leave despite the war. The Kenyan woman who I was in touch with during the war was living in the Burj Hamoud neighborhood, which was not itself actually targeted at any point. She was living in a 2-bedroom house with one other Kenyan. During the war, she had to take in 8 other women into her small accommodation, and in some cases actually had people who knew where she was dropping people off outside her home and then just leaving to safer areas. During this entire time, she had no support in terms of access for places to get some funding, for example, to provide food to all of the people that she was providing shelter to. These forms of exclusion suggest a huge gap in the aid response and a severe lack of protection for non-Lebanese displaced. In a country that had been host to many non-Lebanese for decades, one would expect that the aid response would at least to some degree accommodate these groups, even if it does occur in the context of a crisis. Clearly it did not, and I would argue that this has something to do with the stability framing through which the aid sector has been engaging the Lebanese authorities at both the national and the municipal levels. And this is what I would argue are some of the pitfalls of stability. For one, the stability framing focuses largely on preventing or alleviating tensions, which rise during times of vulnerability and crisis. Relations are seen as the risk rather than something that could be cultivated as a resource or a source of support during times of crisis. The tensions framing of crisis casts an image in which the social fabric has been pulled taut from its corners and is now at risk of rupture whenever a crisis occurs. And it's for this reason that the title of my talk refers to stability, security, and solidarity stretched thin. Not because this is necessarily the state in Lebanon, although in some ways it is, but to denote how Lebanon's social landscape is being cast in the media and in aid policy under this tensions framing. Efforts at building social cohesion in Lebanon, which has been reframed as stability, have tended to focus on the threat of mass forced returns and the diminishment of tolerance among the host population for hosting Syrians. But I would argue that the stability agenda has focused too much on this preservation of the protection space and not enough on creating inclusive spaces where people can achieve some level of security and dignity, which is the idea of the original social cohesion concept. While some smaller scale aid actors have worked to continue working on cohesion quietly and building relationships among people, putting people into contact with one another from across different groups, the majority of large scale organizations have focused to this more tension-averse approach. During the war, we see the consequences of this because without any real rights for refugees, let alone empowerment of refugee organizations, non-Lebanese were largely excluded from the humanitarian aid that was provided. Another characteristic of the approach in Lebanon is that it's tended to focus on negotiations by the aid agency on behalf of refugees. This was this kind of learning the local literacy and engaging politically that I mentioned before, that which Carolyn Quejato and Lauren Landau referred to as stealth humanitarianism, a somewhat political engagement in order to keep the aid space open. Municipalities that hosted large numbers of refugees were offered financial support to cover their services, such as waste disposal, sometimes simply covering their overhead costs. There was also an occupation free of charge program that was started, in which landlords in Lebanon, who are all Lebanese, were offered funds to fix up substandard housing in exchange for allowing Syrian families to occupy those accommodations for a fixed period. So these were both attempts to create a win-win situation for local governments or Lebanese people in order to try to keep the space open so that Syrians could be hosted. But I would argue that this was a bit different from the situation I described in Kenya. This was negotiation by the aid actors to sort of compensate Lebanon for this refugee burden, rather than an attempt to find a more positive way for refugees to contribute socially and economically in the country where they were living. I have a quote here from one Syrian man who was describing his experience with this occupation free of charge program. What he said was, "We were living peacefully here for years. It was after the intervention that everything got worse. From then on, they started viewing us as a source of economic gain. There was a great imbalance between the landlord and the tenant. The landlord always had an upper hand, a dominant one. For example, if the landlord was given this money to purchase a new door, he would buy this cheap door and pocket the rest of the money. You can't talk because if you talk, you'll be kicked out. We just try to be as neutral as possible." Many of the Syrians I talked to found that basically as soon as the house was fixed up and the aid organizations would leave, they would be put out on the street, and now the fixed up accommodation would be provided usually to a Lebanese tenant or a family member of the landlord. If we look at the example from Kenya that I described before, negotiations with the Turkana County government fostered a more positive narrative about the economic and social contributions of refugees living in the Kakuma and Kalabeye settlements. But the arrangements in Lebanon have largely been to compensate the host community for taking on a burden, to pay landlords to keep refugees in their houses. If anything, this reinforces the narrative that refugees are a burden, which is itself a result of the highly restrictive environment in which they are forced to live in Lebanon. Last point I'll make is that this is not entirely surprising, as much of the aid funding for stability in Lebanon, especially from the European Union, has explicitly been focused on bolstering border security and preventing irregular migration into Lebanon and beyond. These are basically border externalization strategies from the European Commission and have included programs in Lebanon such as the Integrated Border Management. Their attempts to stop irregular migration through Lebanon, which it's feared would eventually end in the European Union. So in many ways, this is ultimately part of even though not all of the programs in the aid industry are part of this strategy, but we can see that stability is very much in line with the European Union's containment strategy, an attempt to keep refugees in the region rather than allowing onward movement toward other areas where they might seek a more durable asylum, such as Europe. So to wrap up my argument, stability has been identified as the politically acceptable language for social cohesion work in Lebanon. But with this conceptual swap is also a drift in priorities, with important consequences for the future of Syrians living in protracted displacement, as well as various other migrants who are also living part of their lives in Lebanon. The point is made succinctly by the director of one other small NGO with whom I spoke. And he said, "The danger is that if we focus on stability, maybe we lose a little bit of that basic conceptual framework that we started with. With stability, we can create mechanisms to stop conflict from escalating, but that's just a negative approach. We're then missing the positive approach, creating a project that helps people work together and see that they can benefit from each other, to see that their interest, at least momentarily, is shared and can be built in a certain way. This is the human approach, the cohesion approach, and in a sense, the solidarity approach." End quote. So there's no doubt that tailoring their appeals to national and local governments in the right language can help humanitarian actors to negotiate for the rights of the people that they are supposed to serve. But just as aid organizations that bend the rules in order to accommodate complex local political realities cannot completely let go of their humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, etc., I would argue that social cohesion actors cannot completely relinquish the more aspirational principles that are part of social cohesion as a concept. The situation of migrants during the assault by Israel, with the utter exclusion of Syrians and other non-Lebanese from shelters, and the lack of support also to the frontline refugee and migrant networks that were providing support, was the consequence of an aid response that has largely subordinated principles of inclusion, recognition, and dignity in order to manage tensions and preserve the protection space. The worse things have gotten, the more aid actors have retreated into a more stability-oriented approach, arguably just when more cohesion would actually be necessary in order to respond to the crisis. What would I argue could happen? I think what we have here is this, we have a pragmatic, politically responsive turn to stability, but I would argue that there would be a need for a more principled pragmatism. I'm using the terminology that Catherine Brune has used when describing some of the new ways that aid organizations could negotiate with local actors, including local authorities. So much of the focus during the war, and much of the focus during the war was, of course, on tensions. It was on the identification of negative sentiments that need to be put down, circulating narratives that need to be halted or addressed. Often there's something that happens where when a municipality takes a negative action against Syrians, this is the point at which the aid organizations step in to try to achieve stability and deal with the tensions. I would argue that what also has to happen is that there has to be attention to moderate voices, to the people who could potentially be agents of change toward a more inclusive approach. And I will say that I did, when I was doing research, we conducted interviews in a number of places that were described as high tension places. And in all of these places, if you run a survey, you tend to get back survey responses that are very negative. How do people here feel about displaced Syrians on a Likert scale? You tend to get back negative responses. If you have an interview with people, if you listen, you tend to hear people move slowly into a more moderate space as they actually allow themselves to speak and express themselves fully. You also find a number of people in those areas that probably could be and are quiet allies of the humanitarian actors working there. I talked to a number of people who described and recognized that Syrians are utterly helpless, and while a lot of people are opposing their presence here, there are many of us who actually think that they need help in the same way that we do. So there is this potential for solidarity, even though the government has generally said that this is not to be approached. A second thing that needs to be done is that even if for now there's not much space for, or there isn't seen to be much space for solidarity between Lebanese and other migrant communities, there needs to be support for networks that can actually, within those communities, that can provide support. I will say that in many cases, these are not registered organizations. They're local leaders who've brought together networks of people who can provide a response. What example would be, for example, the Kenyan woman I described earlier who opened up her house to 8 people. These are the kinds of local responses that are an immediate response. And even when there's silence from the aid sector, these people are continuing to provide some sort of social safety net to people within their community. There should be more forms of, even if it's temporary emergency funding to support people to undertake this kind of work. It could also be done by developing some partnerships with local organizations, even if they're never actually going to achieve formal recognition as an organization. And finally, at a higher level of funding, I think we should all be critical of the recent funding deal between the EU and Lebanon, the so-called EU-Lebanon migration deal. The EU has promised €1 billion to Lebanon with certain conditions that include not only reform of Lebanon's banking sector, and this is something that I think a lot of Lebanese citizens would actually agree with, but it also includes efforts at containment and prevention of irregular migration. So it's this idea of using Lebanon as a holding area for Syrians in order to prevent them from moving onward. This funding is being provided to Lebanon and supporting their border management, supporting their security infrastructure, despite the fact that there have been increasing cases of the violation of rights of Syrians in Lebanon over the past 2 years. Many Syrians have been arrested, imprisoned without a cause. Some have been picked up and in the same day deported back to Syria. At minimum, this funding should have been used to some degree to negotiate for some basic level of rights and inclusion for refugees. More ambitiously, and I think this is probably too ambitiously, the EU should actually stop imposing such containment efforts through its funding, as these policies themselves are hugely destabilizing. Arguably, stability would best be facilitated by letting refugees from the country with the highest per capita concentration of refugees in the world to move somewhere else in search of other opportunities. Yet it is striking in Lebanon that these policies have successfully contained the debate about what should be done about the presence of Syrians. The debate is often between whether Syrians should stay in Lebanon or go back to Syria. There's very little concern about the fact that they have been rejected. The option to move elsewhere has largely been rejected. And these attempts at border externalization have intentionally been, for example, returning boats from Lebanon that try to leave across the Mediterranean. So to wrap up, my talk shouldn't be taken to say that the work of the stability sector in Lebanon hasn't been important. Lebanon's refugee response is now informed by a more robust conflict sensitivity framework, more robust than most of the other countries in the region. And the stability agenda has been important in preventing collective actions against entire Syrian communities following crimes by Syrian individuals. Attempts to keep a finger on the pulse of anti-refugee sentiment, to identify and respond to circulating narratives, and to avert intercommunal tension are certainly an important contribution to protection. Rather, if there's any recommendation to come out of my work, it's that cohesion should be held apart from the stability agenda, not replaced by it. The stability-oriented approach to mitigating tensions is not just a light version of cohesion or a politically acceptable version of cohesion. The focus on stability treats social relations as a threat, as points of opposition that become volatile during crisis. Tension is to be avoided so that the social fabric remains intact. Cohesion, on the other hand, works in the inverse. Cohesion is something that is cultivated and grown through political engagement that nonetheless needs to be attuned to the principles of inclusion, dignity, and security. In the cohesion approach, relationships are not connections to be preserved, but a resource upon which people can draw for support, especially during crisis. And if the stability sector is concerned about the corrosive influence of circulating narratives about refugees, there should be an awareness that the stability framing is itself, in many cases, part of that narrative. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful talk. And we have over 30 minutes for Q&A. And we have both people online and in person, obviously. So Hannah will pass the mic to those who have questions, and I will also read out on the online Q&A. And does anyone have a question to start with? If not, I can steal the chance to do that. Okay. Thank you so much, Cory, for that really great talk. And I think you raised really interesting points about language of social cohesion and obviously how that was eventually moved towards stability. And I think one question I have is, or thought I have, is how language of stability intersects with language of used to actually describe the legal status of refugees. You know, in a country that doesn't even consider itself a country of asylum, they consider themselves very much a country of transit. They want UNHCR to resettle people in 6 months. And as you've mentioned, only a minority of refugees are actually registered. So 80% of Syrians in Lebanon are actually considered illegal. And as you said, it's meant that they've been exposed to abuse. And even kind of the economic competition that you mentioned is because Syrians are accepting lower pays because they're not actually legally allowed to work in Lebanon. So I was just thinking, is there any kind of hope for a concept of social cohesion without actually first advocating for the legal right to be a refugee.
So that's a really good point. I think to some degree the push for rights kind of tends to go hand in hand with changing the discourse about the inclusion of people from different nationalities. I mean, if I look at the case of Kenya, the two things kind of happened at the same time. As there was a push for this self-reliance agenda that would allow aid to refugees to be used as a source of income by Kenyan businesses, for example, you also started to see more openness to, for example, freedom of movement. And at least at the local level, there was legal recognition of refugee businesses, freedom of movement, at least as far as the county boundary was recognized, even if refugees couldn't move the rest of the way easily to Nairobi. So I think these two things can kind of work hand in hand. At this point in Lebanon, this is now 14 years later on, I'm not sure much can be done at this point because the policies are very much set. And I mean, the resources that any displaced Syrians entered the country with, which could have been built upon, have largely been depleted. I think in many ways, this is probably a lesson that in the future, aid agencies shouldn't be so quick to change to a rhetoric that's more politically suitable if it means completely dispensing with certain principles like inclusion. So maybe if this approach had been taken earlier on, if there'd been a little bit more careful diplomatic pushback by the aid sector about moving completely into the stability approach, I think things would be different now. I think it would be a better and more inclusive situation. At this point, as you said, I don't know that that it would be very easy to go back from where it is right now. Many politicians have also they found that it's so easy to scapegoat refugees, and there hasn't really been much pushback against this idea. When, as I said, when aid agencies do this kind of negotiation with municipalities to try to get them to keep refugees in their area, they're also reinforcing this narrative of the refugee burden, which is not the situation that has to be in place. So,
thank you very much. Tom, just 1 second for Hannah to make her way to you.
Thank you very much, Cory. I really appreciated the talk and found the comments that you made, particularly on occupancy free of charge, very interesting and something that I had long suspected. But I had two questions. The first one was to ask you how much of this stability framing is a result of what is often considered to be the fundamental crisis of government in Lebanon. It felt as though a little bit you were shying away from identifying state fragility as a crucial fact here. And I wondered on your thoughts of that, because it's certainly the way that it's been presented very much in the media here. And then my second question was, where is resilience in all of this? Because that was very much the buzzword that was circulating around the humanitarian industry for about a decade. And it would seem to be the best way to address that risk of rupture that you're talking about, the fundamental insecurity and instability that might result from these kind of tensions within a state. So is there a relationship between the framing of stability and the resilience agenda? And if so, what is it?
And can I take that now, or?
Yes, you can go to that one.
So I think from what I heard during the conversations I had with aid actors, this stability agenda came from the government, at least insofar as it was applied to the aid regime. So this was actually the fact that they were calling for social cohesion, and there was a pushback from the government to say, just focus on stability because that will be more helpful. At that time, it was not really, it was stability of Lebanon as a hosting country and stability in terms of these municipalities that were seen as highly vulnerable because they were hosting large numbers of displaced Syrians. It wasn't even actually, so that the switch from what was initially called the cohesion sector, or I think it was the livelihoods and cohesion sector for 1 year in Lebanon, when it was eventually switched to stability was 2015. It wasn't for another 4 years until some of the surveys about stability also started asking about issues between Lebanese, about the stability, for example, of municipal services, which had more to do with what you mentioned in terms of the state's ability to function. So I think that entered later, but was not, from my understanding, the reason of the shift in language initially. But it is true that the two have become intertwined now. And I think that stability kind of provides, it's a useful term for people to use because it's flexible in how it's actually used. So the international groups can argue for stability and mean that they want to push for this containment sort of agenda, while at the same time arguing that there's still some level of an idea of social cohesion within this, even though that hasn't been seen in many of the mainstream programs that have been promoted. The second question on resilience, I mean, resilience has been, something that's been widely recognized as a characteristic of a lot of Lebanese communities and their ability to withstand a long history of repeated conflicts, cycles of violence, a state that has done a terrible job of providing for people. I don't think that resilience has been a term applied in terms of understanding the place of Syrians. And in fact, I don't think that's what the Lebanese state wants. I'll also say that I've been careful to use the word resilience because there's also a lot of, there's been some understandable negativity among Lebanese about the term for the simple reason that there's a view that we're not that resilient, we're just dealing with all of this. In some ways, that resilience has sort of been held up as a way to say the Lebanese can handle it, even though they have all of these problems that they're dealing with. So there's actually also been some pushback against the use of that term, which I think can be frustrating when it's coming from the outside.
Thank you. I had two questions as well, if I might. One was about historical narratives and the concept of collective guilt, but also sort of collective credit. You mentioned that there was a lot of antipathy among Lebanese against Syrians for associations, rightly or wrongly, with the Syrian army's occupation of the country. But also, when I was in Lebanon 7 or 8 years ago, I heard people also say that, well, in the 70s or 80s, when the Lebanese civil war was raging, Syria was very good at taking Lebanese refugees in, and therefore we need to kind of do our part as well. Mm-hmm. And then the second question was about impacts of the large influx of refugees on the confessional system. I could see many ways in which it would exacerbate some of these tensions, particularly given the demographic sort of particularities of the folks coming in. But on the other hand, is it also kind of conversely helping to create a more unified Lebanese identity vis-a-vis a Syrian other, which is now sort of more up close and personal than before?
Can you repeat just that last part? What was that about?
If there was basically the kind of Syrian other is helping to create a unified Lebanese sort of identity that transcends some of these confessional divides, or if that's not something that you've seen.
So on the issue of how it's affecting the confessional system, I would definitely say it's not been something that's ever been seen as a more unifying approach, whether it's across that border or within Lebanon. I've not come across anything along those lines. There might be certain political movements from several decades ago that did envision an idea of greater Syria that might have been open to that now, but none of them are really major players at this point. I would say that what I find odd about the confessional concerns is that if we look at the situation of the Palestinians who are in Lebanon, there have been Palestinians in Lebanon since the Nakba, since 1948, and they still don't have citizenship. They have still not in any way affected the confessional balance of power. So this is one issue that I have found it a bit strange that there was this supposed concern about the influx of Syrian people, displaced Syrians from one confession, Sunni predominantly, and that affecting Lebanese politics. Also, Lebanon it's an incredibly restrictive nationalization. Their naturalization rules are very strict. It's only men who can pass Lebanese nationality to their children. So this idea of being, you can't really move to Lebanon and become Lebanese. That's not even something that's ever been on the table. So this narrative, I'm not entirely sure where it's come from. If there's an idea that eventually it would maybe that these laws could change, and then there would be a risk of a demographic change, that might be an issue. I will say that the narratives that I've heard, there have been some that have been pretty extreme. They're especially usually in upper class neighborhoods where people don't actually have as much direct contact with Syrians. But this idea that all of the Syrian ITSs, the informal tented settlements or the camps, are actually sleeper cells of Syrians from the regime that are going to take over. More recently, there's been an idea in some Christian neighborhoods that Syrians are being deployed as militias by Hezbollah into other areas, none of which has been backed up by any, or even seems very likely. So I would say that I think the level at which these kinds of narratives are circulating does indicate why there has been this sense of the arrival and the protracted displacement of Syrians affecting sectarian relations because of these narratives that depict them as being on one side or the other in terms of politics. And can you repeat the first part of the question was?
The one about the historical narratives?
Yeah.
And whether there's this sort of sense of indebtedness for the sort of Syrian people writ large having taken in Lebanese. I mean, there are major demographic disparities as well. Mm-hmm. That's something that I've heard.
Yeah, I've heard very different narratives. I have heard this about, especially for 2006, actually, even when Israel attacked in 2006, swaths of Dahieh were destroyed very quickly, and a lot of Lebanese took shelter in Lebanon. Lebanese took shelter in Syria. This also happened during the last conflict. At least, I think, 200,000 Lebanese crossed the border and stayed temporarily in Syria, where it was seen to be at least temporarily safer. So that issue came up along. I mentioned people who actually do have more moderate views, and that was an issue that I heard. And I heard it even in neighborhoods such as Ferzol, which is in the Bekaa, which is it's a predominantly Christian area near Zahle, where one of the biggest battles against the Syrian military had taken place during the Lebanese civil war. So mostly Christian militias from the Uat were fighting against Assad's military in that area. It's an area where you find some of the most negative perceptions about Syria and about Syrians on the basis that, I lost a relative to that fighting. So there's a personal connection to it historically. But I will say even in those areas, you also hear people referring to cases such as 2006, where they knew many people who moved and took up, managed to find refuge in Syria. So I suppose, if anything, maybe there is some attempt now to engage with these narratives. And I know that the UNDP is trying to more systematically track some of these narratives so that they can find out ways that organizations can try to intervene, or local civil society organizations in Lebanon can be informed about them to try to do some debunking or pre-bunking of circulating narratives in some cases. But I think maybe part of what they also need to do is to also amplify some of those more positive narratives that you spoke about, rather than always just doing this tackling of negative narratives, which seems to be where most of the focus is.
Sorry, if I might, did you find a kind of correlation? Did you find a correlation with kind of which groups had positive or negative correlations? I know you mentioned class just now, but are there any other major factors that sort of stand out just off the top?
So class was actually the main thing that we found whenever we did this study. One thing to say is that I did a brief study with AUB, the American University of Beirut, and it was in partnership with UNDP. We got, through a data sharing agreement, some access to survey data from the stabilization surveys that are conducted by UNDP. And it's an impressive survey. They've done at least 16 waves now. And I think the total sample size is something like 60,000 people. So it's a very large survey that's been done. We were not allowed to publish the results that or to release the results that we put out. And I will say this is part of this attempt to sort of be careful about the narratives that go out. Because one of the things that was found in the paper that we drafted was that you did seem to see not just one kind of tension, but rather two sort of opposing tension constructs. There's one kind of tension that is mostly concerned with economic grievances, so the effect of the presence of Syrians on rent, the distribution of who gets what aid, how this maybe affects rising prices in local shops. That's one side, and that tended to be present among more vulnerable households. They didn't have income in the survey, but there we had a metric, a score for vulnerability. Lower vulnerability households, presumably better off, didn't have many of these concerns about economic grievances, but had more of what I would call prejudicial attitudes. They answered very negatively to questions about, would you want to live near a Syrian? Would you want to, there was a question about, would you be okay if your child married someone from Syrian background? And they were more negative on those. So I think class, probably in many ways, I would say just as much as sect, is a huge determination of how people are, which circles are circulating these narratives.
Before we take in more questions, can I ask the two online just because people are waiting? So there's two questions online, and I'll read them out both to you, but they're slightly on different matters. The first one being, can you speak more about Syrian refugees and work migrants' access to health services and what that looks like? And the second question, I think, relates to a point you made about Palestinians. And this person is raising kind of a tension between Hezbollah's role in Palestine and Lebanon, and yet there's refusal in Lebanon to think about citizenship for Palestinians. And they are asking if this came up in your interviews at all about Palestinian refugees' rights and the lack of citizenship despite the history.
Mm-hmm. I'll say honestly on the first question, just in terms of access to healthcare, I don't have a whole lot to contribute on that. I know that the main thing I would just say is that since the halting in 2015 of the registration of Syrians as refugees, it's been much harder for Syrians to get any kind of documentation. Now the expectation is generally that they're supposed to get a residency permit, and this would be the legal documentation needed to access services, to travel through internal border checkpoints, this kind of thing. And that has also been much more difficult to get. And that seems to be an intentional placement of bureaucratic hurdles that make it something of an administrative nightmare. And I would also say that Catherine Costello and others here actually did some really useful work on this a few years ago, and were developing what they referred to as refugee recognition regimes. And that when these differ in different places, these are a big part of determining whether people can access rights. It's not just a matter of refugee status determination, but even sometimes an informal kind of recognition from the UNHCR that at least provides a status and documents that people can use to access services. And that has not been easy in Lebanon. On the issue of Palestinians, the main narrative that came across more negatively in a lot of the interviews that we did with people in communities that were hosting Syrians was this concern that the history of the Palestinians in Lebanon was one of they moved to Lebanon and then there was this militarized force operating on Lebanese soil. So a lot of groups were afraid of that happening with Syria, even though there was really no reason that, especially 5 years on, that should have been expected. There was one conflict in Arsel, where right near the border, where certain groups moved across into Arsel and got engaged in fighting with the Lebanese military. But this idea of sleeper cells in the camps was just really a circulating narrative. I would say this comment makes a lot of sense in the sense that I guess you could say a contradiction in Hezbollah's solidarity with Hamas and solidarity with the Palestinians, while at the same time Palestinians and Lebanese in Lebanon have not achieved their rights. I would say Hezbollah is not usually they're not really determining whether Palestinians have rights in Lebanon. That's blocked by a much larger coalition of parties.
I know, Severine, you raised your hand a few times. Hannah? Severine, right. If you still want to ask.
I think the question has been somehow is, what difference does the stability of social cohesion approach make to the employment of refugees and the education of the children? Because you mentioned mainly the housing, but what about the children of these migrants? Are they go to school somewhere, and does this approach actually have a difference to their lives?
I would say in the case of education, I think this is Hiba's area of expertise. I would say the one thing that just came up a lot during my interviews and that I think bothered me the most is that there's never really been any turn away from the double shift system, and the double shift system in Lebanon has really it's a public education system that is already very much underfunded. Teachers are not receiving enough salaries. Even Lebanese students are not getting a very good education. And especially during the crisis, many schools were at times on strike. Teachers weren't even showing up because they were making such a pitiful salary. But nonetheless, this systematic double shift system, which is where Lebanese students go to school in the morning and Syrian students in the evening, this is resulting in a very long-term sense of division between those two communities. And some of the not even interviews, but just conversations I had with younger Syrians talked about the fact that they just have no interaction. This is like a systematic division of the children based on nationality. As a result of that, they don't play at the same time. They don't play in the same groups. So access for Syrians to schools is also low. I would say that's a big part of that has also been transportation costs in many areas. One of the few things that's positive in this direction has been some provision of informal schooling by Syrian-run, refugee-run organizations. At least in this case, they've provided, in some cases, I think, and from what I've read, maybe you would comment on that, a higher quality education than a lot of the public schools. But this doesn't address the issue of the division.
Thank you very much, Cory. I was wondering about the cohesion because of the failure, in a way, of the confessional system, political system at the moment in Lebanon. So maybe, do you think it would be one reason? I fully agree that the pressure from European Union on stability is very important, but don't you think that there is a sort of reluctancy to speak of cohesion because of the failure of the confessional system in politics? Mm-hmm. And my second question would be, and you mentioned it, about the class factor between Syria and Lebanon. Maybe because there are a lot of families from the upper society who are really linked between Syria and Lebanon. So it could be a sort of hidden factor of not wanting to allow people to come, but in fact there are already a lot of connections. So it's one of the weak points of the division between Syria and Lebanon, which in fact are two countries very close to one another. What do you think of that?
Yeah, on the issue of this big question about sectarian politics, I don't want to make any like grand claims to this, especially as an American, because I think on the one hand, I don't know if I would even say that the system has been a complete failure. Of course, the state has largely not been providing the service that it needs. There have been huge issues of corruption in the state, and this has to do with sectarianism because the systems by which a lot of resources are distributed informally tend to follow sectarian lines. So that has created a system in which the state is not always functioning as a cohesive state, but is sort of more following the sectarian lines. At the same time, as far as power sharing, and especially in the most recent generation, there is more of a sense now of Lebanese identity much beyond just sectarian identity. I think that the call for people to open their houses whenever all of these people were displaced, most of them Shia, and moving into other areas that were from other sects, indicates that to some degree there is a space for a more, a national identity. And the second question on
the class factors and the closeness between
Yeah. I mean, one of the places that we did research was, and especially this is, I think, the case in Akkar and in the border regions, Akkar and also the Bekaa Valley. Some of the places where Syrians initially decided to move was actually on the basis of long-standing connections. And this is something that Professor Don Chatty has noted before, that, of course, a lot of the ITSs, the tented settlements that were set up in the Bekaa, were not just new arrivals who didn't know the area. They were founded by migrant workers who'd been coming to those places to work seasonally in agriculture for decades. And now they were sort of just bringing their families with them and staying and maybe bringing some of their connections. So certainly there were economic connections there. We worked in one area where we did some interviews. And actually in that area, it turned out that a lot of the people, the Lebanese people and the Syrians arrived, actually had distant, extended familial connections. They were from the same ashira or clan. So this definitely plays a factor in where people go. I think I expected when we did that part of the study that I would hear more about solidarities between people because of this clan factor. I think one thing I've heard is just how potent the circulating political narratives have been, because even in places where people actually share even distant familial connections, a lot of Syrians were still talking about just how much discrimination they were facing even from their neighbors and how much they were being looked down upon. So I think these circulating narratives about Syrians being outsiders have been very effective in destroying any of these potential solidarities that would have pre-existed that.
Thank you. I think we have time for 3 more questions. So thank you, Hannah.
Hi, thanks. I'm curious about the sort of the coherence in the interpretation of the framework of stability at different levels of aid work. That is, are NGOs on the ground sort of bound by the interpretation of stability that's used by the international NGOs and actually negotiating that, okay, stability is an acceptable way of referring to cohesion and may have a different meaning? Like, are the local NGOs actually, does the state have an ability to actually make sure that stability to them doesn't mean the same thing as cohesion?
So no, I would say that it's definitely it's a flexible signifier. It's not something that's imposed as like these are the rules on stability. There's a framework that's developed by the stability sector, but actually I think there was an idea, and some people that I spoke to described that you can call it stability and still kind of do what you want to do. I think though what happens in a lot of cases is that unless I mentioned one person from an organization that talked about what is lost by switching to stability, I think unless that approach is maintained, that mindset, you do tend to see a quiet shift into a more stability-oriented approach, because the terms that we use do affect the work that we're putting out. How we brand our work, how humanitarians brand their work affects how they design the projects that they're doing. So when stability tends to be the word that you're putting out to the public, I think they kind of end up policing themselves because they want to do something that makes sense under the idea of promoting stability. I will say that in the few cases, there were smaller scale projects that I think were doing a better job of trying to promote bonding and bridging relationships, that were trying to bring people together in constructive places. We're still quietly using the word cohesion and weren't letting themselves, they had funding maybe that was from, for example, faith-based funding, allowing them to continue to use that terminology.
Thanks.
Time for 2 more questions if there are any. Now, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cory, for your presentation. You have worked with this social cohesion agenda for last several years, and I want to hear your assessment. And for example, can aid organization actually foster social cohesion through external interventions? And also relatedly, social cohesion, is it a quantifiable, measurable concept? And otherwise, how aid organizations are assessing the outcomes? I know these are broad question, but I appreciate it.
Good questions, but so I have seen programs. One of the projects that we looked at was what was called a youth champions project. So taking young people from different backgrounds, different nationalities, and bringing them together to do some trainings together, and then go out and implement projects in their communities that responded to some of the issues they were dealing with because of the economic crisis, in some cases because of the protracted displacement. And in that program, actually, on the one hand, they all hated the term youth champions. But on the other hand, I did hear a lot about how this project, they felt that this was actually an opportunity to dispel some of the stereotypes that they had across other groups, especially in the Bekaa, where a lot of people will live within certain neighborhoods and then travel to Beirut, but they won't travel and deal with people who are just a few neighborhoods away on a regular basis. So in that case, I think that at least this was a small scale project. It was only engaging 40 people, and it also wasn't very expensive. But you did see this opportunity for young people to be coming together, and then visibly in public, going out and implementing projects together. So people see people interacting and getting along and doing something. There was one waste collection project where the municipality had not been doing a great job of doing waste pickup. So a group of Syrians and Lebanese, I think one Palestinian, went around and we were visibly seen cleaning up the neighborhood. That does have, I think that probably has a positive effect. That leads to the other question, which is, can you measure that? I don't know that you can really measure that quantifiably in a way that's going to make sense for monitoring and evaluation of programs or determining, did this work? I think a lot of the investments in social cohesion are going to be really long-term impacts, creating the possibility for there to be personal bonds that maybe come into play in the next generation. Not the sort of things where you do a project cycle over the course of a year or two, redo a survey and see if people feel differently. We did work a little bit with the stabilization surveys, and I think that there should be a lot of question about these surveys that try to measure tension by asking people about it. Because one, people know exactly what you're doing with that survey. And they're often, I think, giving back an answer that it's a message they want to give, not something that is that's very much reflecting what they actually think. One of the things we did, and we haven't published on this yet, is we did take some questions from the UN Stabilization Survey and asked that to a group of about 40 people. And each survey was also followed up by an open-ended interview. So now in their own terms, they can describe what they think. And what we tended to find was that the answers to the survey, where you have to put your answer in a box, tended to be really negative. How do you think Syrians and Lebanese are getting along here? Bad. But when people talk, they talk about, well, actually, I'm getting along. I engage on a daily basis with some of the people down the street, and the person in this shop is a really nice guy. And so you do tend to get a much more nuanced answer whenever you allow people to actually explain themselves. And that's one of the reasons I think it's good to be skeptical of these more quantitative approaches to measure tension.
Thank you so much. I think we've run out of time for questions. So thank you so much, Cory. And you're also being thanked online. So.
Yes, and just to say a final word, many thanks to Heba for chairing the session and for Cory. These are really, really challenging times, both for humanitarian work with displaced people and for the funding for research into this area. It's all suddenly changed in the last year, month and a half, for reasons you no doubt are aware of. So I think what we've seen this evening is the value of serious academic empirical research in the field. I know that one reason why the Jesuit Refugee Service International has so valued the work of both Heba and Cory is it enables their reflection to happen at a much deeper level than it would be able to do otherwise. And the value of this research for humanitarian work, for informing policy and political action is huge. And I think we've seen the value of that this evening. So many, many thanks, Cory. I hope we can continue to support your work and work with you as you continue at the Lebanese American University. And we value our work very much with the Refugee Study Centre here in Oxford, and hope we can continue that collaboration well into the future. So many thanks to all joining us online and to all here, and have a very good evening, everybody. Let's keep going.